they just didn't say panic. And it wasn't until I went to a family doctor, like a general practitioner, that she said, "Does your family have a history of panic?" And my dad was with me by that time because I was so sick that he'd flown in. And he said, "Oh, yeah, yeah, me and her mom both have had anxiety and panic." Acting is not the source of my anxiety. In fact, it's the source of a lot of relief for me, which is, part of why I named the book Get Thee to a Therapist. If you are 16 and your mom has sent you to therapy because she feels like you're acting out, you can talk about your mom in therapy. And even though your mom's paying for it, your therapist cannot tell your mom what you said in therapy. You
Mhm.
are safe. If your boss is paying for your therapy, you can talk about work. Your therapist cannot tell your boss what you said in therapy.
Hi, on this episode of Calmly Coping, I had the pleasure of chatting with Reba Buhr. She's an awesome author, actress, host, voiceover artist, and mental health advocate who's on a mission to help people overcome barriers to mental health care. She shares her own journey with anxiety and panic attacks and how she became an advocate for mental health services. We also talked about the importance of breaking down stigma and fear surrounding mental health, and Reba gives practical tips for those new to seeking help for mental health struggles, including coping strategies and navigating insurance. This is a super informative and insightful conversation that you won't want to miss. Hey, Tati here, and welcome to Calmly Coping. I am here with Reba Buhr. She is an actress, voiceover artist, and author of the book Get Thee to a Therapist. And so I am super excited to be speaking with her today. So thank you so much for being here, Reba.
Thank you for having me, Tati. It's a pleasure.
So I'm curious to hear what inspired you to write this book.
So this book started as a blog back when blogging was a little more popular and common. I feel like it's not as much anymore. And I had just I sort of have had two really big mental health breakdowns in my life. And I was working through my second one. I was about 26, so not able to really work very much at the time. I had a lot of free time on my hands because I was just at home panicking all day, every day. And so I started blogging about that. And as I did it more, I found that sharing that stuff publicly brought a lot of people to me, people who were like, I've been feeling this way too, and I didn't really know what was going on with me. Or I just think it's so cool that you're talking about it and it makes me understand it better for somebody who I know also has it, but I didn't really get it. Um, and I realized how powerful it was to be open about it. And I'm not I'm the kind of person who usually is open about things. So I thought, what if I tried writing a book? And then I just kept writing it until it was, whoops, I finished the whole thing.
Hmm.
Um, I
Awesome.
also I also had a lot of people who just didn't understand. They would come to me because they were like, "Okay, I have anxiety. I've had panic attacks. What do I do about it?" They had no idea where to look for help, where to get started, what services were out there for people like them. So that was sort of I thought, this information needs to be out there. It's not, and more people need to know this because it's not just coming naturally to us.
Yeah. Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I think that navigating like the mental health system can be super daunting and complicated, especially for somebody who is just kind of trying to figure it out. And I'm curious to hear because you mentioned having like two breakdowns. So can you speak more about like what your experience was specifically with anxiety and panic?
Yeah, totally. I know now that I've sort of been anxious my whole life. I mean, it started in my preteen years, and I was definitely diagnosably anxious all through high school, but didn't get diagnosed, didn't talk about it to anyone. I just thought that was what life was like. And then in college, I had a precipitating event one night where I passed out due to dehydration, which was not anything larger than that, but it was terrifying. And the next day, I finally had my first real panic attack because all of a sudden I felt like, oh, my body's like an unsafe place and terrible things can happen to me and I'm not in control. If my body's just going to do things, just going to pass out whenever it feels like it. And that panic attack didn't stop for 2 weeks. I was non-functional. I was so scared. And I was in college at the time, and I ended up having to drop out of college for that semester to start after I finally got diagnosed. It took a really long time for doctors to figure out what was going on. To start an antidepressant, to start seeing a therapist, and to just calm down because I was pushing myself so hard at college. I had to relearn how to live because the way I was living and thinking was making me sick. So that was number one. And I did end up getting acclimated to the antidepressant, learning coping skills, and going back to college the next semester and finishing. And then in my mid-20s, I had sort of been managing panic disorder from then on. I firmly had panic disorder. I was terrified of panic attacks, so I would get them, once every couple months, depending on the season I was in. And then I had another freaky event that I don't like to talk about too much, but it sort of felt like having a stalker. So kind of just an isolated incident that set me off. And that resulted in a month of straight panicking before I once again said, I am sick. I need to quit my job. I need to move home to my mom's house and just heal for a couple months. And so that was number 2.
Yeah, so it sounds like you've really been through a lot when it comes to those experiences. And in the first one you had mentioned that you experienced when you were in college, you said like you were going to doctors and they weren't sure what was happening at first. And I think that can be a really common experience, especially with panic attacks, because it is so physical and
Mm-hmm.
because it can feel like there's something medically wrong. Like, am I having a heart attack or a stroke or, what's going on? And like you mentioned, having difficulty with trusting your body. So what was that experience like for you? Like, were you concerned that there was something medically wrong and you had no idea what was happening?
100%. Yes. So that first panic attack was the day after being in the emergency room. So I was convinced that whatever had happened the night before wasn't resolved. I was having that same thing. I was very sick. So I went back to the emergency room and I said, it's my heart. There's something wrong with my heart. It's beating out of my chest. So they gave me all the heart tests in the emergency room and they said, your heart seems okay. And while I was at the emergency room, I was feeling a lot better. So I think I'm okay. And they dismissed me from the emergency room and I walked out the sliding doors to the parking lot and the thumping in my heart came back. So not having any idea that a panic attack could make you sick. I didn't know what a panic attack was. I'd never heard of a panic attack beyond the colloquial, like, oh, I'm having such a panic attack right now,
Mm.
I didn't know that it was a real thing where your body is sort of acting out of sync with your brain. And of course, it's acting in sync with your more instinctive brain, the animal brain. But the logic, it's not really, you don't think you're freaking out in your head. And I think I went back to the emergency room 1 or 2 more times after that, and they just didn't say panic. And it wasn't until I went to a family doctor, like a general practitioner, that she said, does your family have a history of panic? And my dad was with me by that time because I was so sick that he'd flown in. And he said, oh, yeah, me and her mom both have had anxiety and panic and been on antidepressants. And I was like, what?
Mm.
No, nobody ever told me this. Oh, yeah, it was when you were around. but they kept it a secret because they wanted to protect me, but ultimately, I could have really used that information.
Hmm. Yeah, so it sounds like you were really in the dark with that. And I think that especially, now I think more so people are fortunately coming to speak about mental health more and it's becoming more normalized. But
Yes.
even like, 10, 15 years ago, I think it really wasn't something that was talked about as frequently. And so that must have been difficult for you at that time trying to navigate and understand more about like what to do and what you were experiencing.
I was at square zero. Nobody had ever said the words mental health to me before. Nobody had ever explained the concept that the way you live your life and the amount of stress you take on can have an effect on your physical well being. My mother had always tried to manage my stress level. I'm such a high achiever, and when I was in school, I wanted to do everything. I wanted to be involved in everything, and she would put rules and say, "No, you can only sign up for one extracurricular activity per semester," or "I don't want you going out with your friends until super late at night because you have school the next day." Not realizing that what she was saying was, if you do these things, you're gonna you're not gonna sustain, you're gonna get sick in some way. She never explained that. Maybe she didn't have words to explain it. She just sort of knew it instinctually, I think.
Yeah. So she was setting those boundaries with you. And that makes me think of something you mentioned in the book. I think when you were talking about self care, that you like to think of like practicing self care as you're like a mom taking care of like little Reba, I think you had put it. And
Yes.
I thought
Yeah.
that was a great way of describing it because I think that self care can be like the relaxation, the indulgence, and it's also, the boundary setting that I think is something that can be often overlooked.
Yeah. I think I have a great mom. I love my mom. If you don't have that kind of a relationship with your mother, I think that analogy won't work very well for you. But hopefully you do have somebody in your life who, when you were young, uh, did that boundary setting for you so that you can sort of think, okay, that person lives inside me now. And that's the person who's going to tell me to, stay on top of my health, like physicals, eat balanced meals, say no to going out on Friday night if I'm just so beat from the week and I need rest and alone time, even though it sounds fun. And those are hard things to do, especially when you're, in your early 20s and um, you want to just soak up everything the world has to offer.
Hmm. Yeah, totally. And do you think that's what was happening for you, that you were like overexerting yourself?
100%. I was I was I was a double major in theater and music. And when you're a theater major, you never go home. You are always at rehearsal. So,
Mm.
and I was like, at the time, I was a junior, which, as everybody knows, is the hardest year of school. And I was playing the lead in the play and taking it super seriously, even though it was just like a college theater production, but to me, it was like Broadway. So I was not only trying to play the lead in the play, but I was playing Joan of Arc. So I checked every book about Joan of Arc out of the library. And I was like, in all my spare time with my double major, I'm going to read all of these huge, boring books about Joan of Arc so that I can know everything about her. And not only that, but the way I thought and talked to myself, my self talk was, you always need to be doing more. You always need to be where all the people are so that you're included in everything. And you're not pretty enough, you're not skinny enough, you're not smart enough, you're not good enough. So constantly worry about that. Worry about that and work at that to earn your place in this world.
Yeah, that's a lot of pressure to be under,
It's
especially at
plenty.
a especially at a point in time when, you're trying to discover yourself, because young adulthood, I think, is a period of time when people are trying to understand and learn more about themselves and kind of find their place in the world. So I think that can just add to this pressure of like, okay, I need to have it all figured out.
Yeah. Yeah. That you get to school and they're like, great, what do you want to be when you grow up? Choose it
Mhm.
now and study it because this is your life from here on out. It's a lot of pressure you just graduated high school yesterday. You just moved out of your parents' house yesterday. And, you know, they don't tell us it doesn't actually matter what you major in. You can do anything you want for the most part. I mean, I suppose if you want to be a doctor, you should probably probably get started. But other than that, it's not that important. It's college is so much more about just being a springboard, kind of an intermediary period before you're really out there on your own. Or if you're not going to college, which is a totally legitimate option, especially these days, young adulthood, if you mess things up and don't do it perfectly, your life's going to be fine.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think that anxiety can come up when there's this catastrophizing of like feeling like everything you do, if you don't do it right, it's going to be like the end of the world.
Totally. And you don't know how to do it right. So how could you possibly do it right? Your brain's not even done growing. You
Mhm.
know, they never told. I always thought that was a really interesting. I didn't learn that until maybe a couple years ago that the brain's not fully developed until about age 25.
Mhm.
So how could you possibly have everything figured out if you're not fully cooked?
Yeah. That's a great point. Yeah, I remember when I learned that, I was like, wow, that explains a lot. Definitely.
Totally. Yeah. Some of the decisions we made, things like that.
Mhm. But I can imagine, and maybe this is just me coming from like my social anxiety self of like, being in a place of performing and acting, that would create more stress and pressure. I mean, obviously, if it's something that you're passionate about, but I would imagine like just the whole way of like auditioning and putting yourself out there, would you say did those kinds of experiences add to any of the stress and anxiety you're experiencing? And if so, like how do you manage that now?
It's an interesting question because I think a lot of people um, jump to the conclusion that because I'm an actor, the thing that stresses me out, that causes my panic, is acting. And then trolls, people who are being awful will say, "Well, why don't you just stop acting?" But it's it's um it's a misconception. Acting is not the source of my anxiety. In fact, it's the source of a lot of relief for me, which is part of why I named the book "Get Thee to a Therapist." The stage was a place of sanctuary for me, and so for many people, speaking in front of other people is their greatest fear, bigger than death. And yes, when I was in high school and first auditioning for things, I would definitely have major anxiety before an audition because I wanted to do well so badly. And um, anxiety before something like that can be a really good thing because it gives you the adrenaline you need to be super focused and give it your best. And for
Mhm.
me in high school with my anxiety, that wasn't the case. It was too much anxiety to the point where I wasn't really able to eat for 1 day, 2 days, 3 days before the audition because my stomach was just in knots and I felt like just the thought of putting food in my mouth made me sick. Or I would have really bad diarrhea, like right before it was time to go on stage and do a voice recital, which is embarrassing. Um, and those are all anxiety symptoms, and I didn't know at the time. Uh, but those things went away with time, it's exposure therapy, right? I did it so many times that now I just enjoy it. I never get nervous for an audition. I never get nervous for a performance. You want a little bit just to, once again, kind of pump you up and get you out there. But yeah, for me, my fears are always body focused. And they all come from that first time fainting. My fear is,
Mm.
am I going to faint? Am I too hot? Am I dehydrated? Am I undernourished? Am I have I stayed up too late and now I'm delirious and I'm going to pass out? These are the things that I have to watch out for. Make sure I have really good self-talk and have prepared myself. Those are my anxiety triggers.
Mm. Yeah, thanks for sharing more about that. And I think that's really common in what I've experienced or as well with clients that are struggling with panic disorder, that it tends to be those body focused fears of what you mentioned before of not feeling like you can, or worrying that you can't trust your body or that something bad might
Mm-hmm.
happen. Um, and so I want to transition into talking about, because I know a big part of it is, get thee to a therapist, is how do you get the support that you need if you're in this place of struggling with anxiety or panic. And I think that can be really intimidating for many people. It can require a lot of courage to realize that, okay, maybe I need some help and support. So what would you suggest are some steps that somebody can take if they feel like, okay, I think it's time for me to get some support around this?
Hmm. So there's two major roadblocks that I feel like keep most people from seeking support in the form of a therapist. And the first one is the fear around the money, because either they don't have adequate health insurance, which so many people do not, and therapy is expensive, um, and or they have health insurance, but they don't understand it. And asking, like, they don't even know how to ask the right questions to understand it. And now it feels embarrassing to ask how to ask the right questions because they feel like they should already know, or they just want to throw it all away because they're so frustrated that it is this complicated. And why does it have to be this complicated? So just screw it all. So that's one side of it. And then
Mm-hmm.
the other side, I ask people sometimes on my Instagram page, Forget Thee to a Therapist, what are the things that keep you from doing therapy? And the number one thing that comes up is, I don't want to be judged. Not knowing how the therapeutic process works, because you can't know until you've tried it. To go and tell somebody all the things that you're most ashamed about feels miserable. It feels terrifying. So in the book, I try to explain both sides of those things so that somebody doesn't have to ask any questions that feel embarrassing on either end. What is a therapist gonna say to me? What are they gonna think about me? How is therapy gonna go? Do I have to jump in there and immediately tell them all the hardest things that have ever happened in my life? Because I don't want to. I don't like to go there. Um, And also, when I get the bill, am I going to be terrified? Is it going to be awful? Am I going to get surprised with some awful bill? Or, also, if I don't have health insurance, I can't afford $200 a session, or, it costs different things depending on where you live and the cost of living.
Yeah.
But I need a way to do this without it costing that much money. And I don't know where those resources exist.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think those are two important experiences that you highlighted. So let's say the person who is worried about just the financial and insurance end, what would you suggest for them?
So you will do yourself such a favor if you get on the internet or read my book or get on the internet and do some research and figure out what your coverage is and and look for the pitfalls and then get the guts up to get on the phone and call somebody at your insurance company and say, "Hey, explain my mental health coverage to me. Explain exactly what it is." And you may find that you have great mental health coverage because a lot of plans are federally mandated to have, they have to cover mental health at the exact same rate they cover medical if they fall under a certain category of health insurance. So that means whatever your medical benefits are, it might be unlimited visits and a pretty reasonable copay. And you can go see a therapist once or twice a week and only have to pay them $25 a visit. Wouldn't that be great? What a great gift you could give yourself. Um, or you may learn to understand that an another obnoxious thing is it's really hard to get an in-network therapist these days because there are not a lot of them because therapists who take insurance don't make as much money as therapists who don't. So if you were a therapist, you'd probably want to not take insurance and make more money. You may find you have coverage for out-of-network therapy, and you might do the math and realize, oh, I can actually afford this super cool therapist who doesn't happen to take my insurance, but I really vibe with. And even though it's out of network and I have to pay them cash up front, the reimbursement I get back from my insurance makes it so I can afford it. And if you don't have insurance, then you don't need to do all that legwork to figure out what your coverage is. But you do need to figure out where in town you might be able to find um, therapists who either take people in on a sliding scale, because there are therapists out there who have one or two spots open in their practice where they say, I want to do good. I want to help somebody out. I can afford it. So I'm going to take one or two patients who really need it at $30 a session, $40 a session, something that they can afford, even though normally I charge $250 a session. Um, or you can go to a clinic where people who just graduated from therapy school but have to do a certain number of hours before they can take their board exams to be fully licensed are getting those hours under close supervision of licensed therapists, and they are seeing people for, once again, a very low rate or even free sometimes. And you could get in with one of those and pay $15, $25 a session and see that therapist for as long as they're at that clinic, which could be a year or two even, but they will move on eventually. So those are the options on the financial side.
Mhm. Yeah, and thank you so much for sharing that, because I think that um, because people don't know all of those details, that can really lead to a big barrier up front, and then procrastinating because it feels like this overwhelming task of, okay, now I need to call my insurance and reach out to these people. And so I think breaking it down so that people can understand the specifics of it can really help. And I know there's another resource, because you mentioned sliding scale. I don't remember if you mentioned this in the book, but I know there's
Oh,
a
Open
website,
Path?
Open Path. Yeah.
Yes, I
Hmm.
love them. What a great resource. It connects you with all the therapists in the country who um, have said, okay, I'm gonna do this sliding scale thing. And they just raised their prices this last year a tiny bit, about $10, because the world costs more this year than it did last year, and that's just a fact. So I think it is now, you will see a therapist for between $40 and $70 um, cash out of pocket. As long as you need it, they will honor that price. And they are fully
Hmm.
licensed therapists who are practicing and charging more to all their other clients, but they just are offering this to those in need.
Hmm. Yeah, I think that's a great resource. And I think, to go on the other place that you mentioned, why people feel like a barrier to seeking out therapy. They feel like they're going to be judged and worry about, okay, what is this other person going to think? And I think it can feel hard to be in that place. So, what would you suggest for somebody who's feeling that way?
Well, I just want to tell them, and I'm sure you could tell them better than me. Uh, are you in the business of judging your clients?
No,
No.
absolutely not. No.
I so I took I've taken 2 classes in a master's program for therapy before I realized it wasn't the right time for me. And one of the first things they taught us was that um, it is your job as the therapist to practice unconditional positive regard for the person who is sitting in your chair. So your job is to be on their side no matter what. Even if you were going to come in and say, "Hey, I'm cheating on my spouse right now, and I hate it. I hate that I'm doing it, but I'm doing it." It would be your job as the therapist to say, "Okay, I want to learn and understand, and I see in you that you're in pain right now, and we're going to understand why you're unhappy in your current relationship or feeling like you're finding something in this other relationship. We're we're coming at it with compassion for you. I mean, I'm not a therapist, but in that class, I was thinking about it. So they're never, ever, ever, ever going to judge you. And they, something else to know, they can't talk to anybody about what you say in there. They can't even talk to their spouse around at dinner time about what you say in there. And they literally only can talk about what you say to them if you say you're going to hurt yourself or somebody else, or if you say that somebody elderly is being hurt, or I don't know, I can't forget. Oh, if they're like
um, or if
subpoenaed
there's
by the court.
any, yeah, or a subpoena, or if you as a client consent to it. So let's say you want me to, a client says, agrees to me speaking to, I've had this happen before where let's say I'm seeing somebody individually and they also have a couples therapist. And, maybe I want to speak to that other therapist to coordinate their care so we
Mm,
can work together to provide them with the best support. So
yeah.
situations like that, or maybe if it's speaking to a family member, but those are things you have to sign and consent and agree to.
Yeah. If you are 16 and your mom has sent you to therapy because she feels like you're acting out, you can talk about your mom in therapy. And even though your mom's paying for it, your therapist cannot tell your mom what you said in therapy. You
Hmm.
are safe. If your boss is paying for your therapy, you can talk about work. Your therapist cannot tell your boss what you said in therapy. So you're really safe there. And also you're safe from being uncomfortable. You are in charge. So your therapist is never going to make you do or talk about anything you don't want to. And you always have the right to say, I don't feel comfortable right now. And that's going to be honored. And if it's not, then the therapist is in trouble, you
Yeah,
know?
maybe find a new therapist if that
Yeah,
happens.
yeah, exactly. So,
Mhm.
they're gonna, like, say you have a big trauma. When you walk in there on day 1, they're not gonna really ask you about the trauma. They're gonna say, "Why are you here? What do you wanna work on? Tell me about yourself." And you're gonna work up to it. So you're only gonna talk about it when you feel ready.
Mhm.
It's not a scary place.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's important because that having that safety many times for people is one of the only times in their lives where you feel just completely supported by somebody.
Mhm.
And just completely validated and having your experience acknowledged. And I think that's what can make therapy so valuable is the not just what you're learning and the tools, but also the relationship between you and the therapist, and having that example of okay, this is what it looks like and feels like to be fully supported and
Yes.
understood.
Yes. Yeah. Being in therapy has made me a much better friend and partner because now I have this model, this example of what it means to just listen and support, which people need so much. Before I understood that, I always used to try to fix people's problems. And I didn't understand the value in just making somebody feel heard. It's a
Mhm.
beautiful thing that we don't get a lot in the regular world. You kind of need somebody who's gone to school for it.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great point. I think people automatically want to go into, and I was guilty of this too, like problem solving mode, like because it's hard
Hmm.
to see somebody suffer. So you want to fix their problems for them.
Yeah. Especially when you're an anxious person, I think,
Mhm.
because you're uncomfortable with other people's problems. You're uncomfortable with problems in general. Um,
Yeah.
you feel like this isn't safe. We need to solve the problems to restore safety. At least that's how I've always felt.
Mhm. Definitely. Yeah. And so, kind of piggybacking off of therapy, let's say, because I know this is the topic that there's a lot of stigma around and there's a lot of confusion around medication.
Hmm.
So what would you suggest, and what was it like for you? Because I know you spoke about just your journey of getting on medication and that experience.
So the thing I always want to come out with, because there is stigma, is I am supportive of all viewpoints around medication. I think it's incredibly individual. And if you don't want to put meds in your body, I get it. And if you do want to put meds in your body, I get it. I personally put meds in my body, and I've been on them for 15 years now. Um, and I didn't really have any idea what was happening when I started my antidepressants because I had been so sick, so physically ill in such an acute way for a couple weeks that I was like a ghost. I just didn't even know what was happening anymore. So when my dad, sort of ushered me into this place, they could have done anything to me. I was just like, what? How do you? Okay, I'll do it. Anything's better than this. Um, but the antidepressants really, really worked. They, they don't happen overnight. They build up pretty slowly in your system. It takes 3 weeks to start feeling something, 6 weeks before it's fully in. And in that time, I just felt this sort of floor rise underneath me that normally before I would just fall into panic really easily. But it was like a floor I could still fall through if it really got bad. But a lot of the panic was sort of just kept buoyed under this floor, and it sort of kept me from falling into it. And I felt funny too. I started having really weird dreams every night, and kind of felt like there was like a bubble around me that sort of kept me from interacting with the world fully. And boy, completely stopped being interested in sex of any kind. But those things didn't last forever, especially like the bubble. That only lasted a few weeks. And the sexual side effects started to abate after about 6 months, but the protection from panic stayed. So I was really grateful for it. And it saved me. It made it so I could get on with my life and go back to school. And I do struggle with judging myself for taking it. And I have really struggled with judging myself for taking it at certain times in my life. Um, and I just had to work through those things because uh, getting off of the medication didn't work. My panic came back. So it's what keeps me stable, and I have to be really grateful for that, even though there are a lot of things I don't love about antidepressants as well.
Mhm. So it sounds like for you, the benefits outweigh the side effects or the
Yes.
downsides.
Yes, and everybody has to make that decision for themselves. Some people have crazy side effects that are really miserable, and the benefits are not outweighing it. But for me, I get more benefit than I lose.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. And I think another benefit that can come from antidepressants that many people don't talk about is that actually the way that it affects your brain is it makes you, if you're finding that therapy is challenging, you're not making changes, or you're having difficulty changing your way of thinking. For some people, going on an antidepressant can be a helpful course to help to make your brain actually more, it's called like plastic. So your
Oh,
brain is more sensitive to making the changes that happen in therapy that can kind of help you to get to that place easier.
I
If that
had
makes
no
sense.
idea. That's completely new information to me.
Yeah, I
That's
learned that
awesome.
pretty recently, but I found that interesting because it can be another tool, in addition to therapy to, if you find that that's the direction you want to take, or if you find that you're having trouble like making progress to add in, taking an antidepressant if your doctor recommends it, can be a helpful addition to that.
Mm, yeah. And then maybe it's more short term for you. Not everybody needs to be on antidepressants their whole life. Some people just take them for a couple years.
Mhm.
I'm a unique case.
Yeah, and that's okay. Because we all have different needs. But what would you
Mhm.
suggest for somebody who is maybe considering wanting to take medication? Would it be a similar route as to seeking out therapy?
So, with medication, here's something that happens sometimes. People don't know the difference between a therapist and a psychiatrist. Or it gets really confusing when somebody calls themselves a psychotherapist because we don't talk about this stuff very much. So, psychiatrists are doctors, and they are the only ones who can prescribe medication. A therapist cannot. They're not a doctor. Even if they have a doctorate, which a lot of them do, they don't have a medical doctorate. Um, and a psychotherapist is just another way of saying therapist. It's not combining psychiatry and therapy, which is I can totally see why people would think that. So you want to make sure you've got the right provider because I've definitely heard stories of people being like, going to therapy and being like, okay, I'm ready for the meds. And the therapist is like, I don't have meds. Or going to the psychiatrist and being like, boy, they didn't really want to listen to my problems very much. They didn't talk to me.
Mm,
It's like, because that's not really what most of them do. There are a few psychiatrists who will combine um, therapy into their practice, but it's pretty rare. Most of the
yeah.
time, it's going to be that they just want to diagnose you and prescribe you some medication. That's what they know how to do. So, yeah, you make an appointment with a psychiatrist, and just like therapy, but worse, getting in with a psychiatrist can be kind of difficult. Uh, I have found that they usually have, often, I'm not going to say usually, have wait times for new patients that can be a month, 6 weeks, 3 months. And that can be awful because when you decide you want help now. So, just keep calling around and trying. And if you're in an emergency situation, enlist the help of your insurance company. Call them up and say, I'm in an emergency situation. I need an appointment now. And they, in some states, are obligated to make that happen for you. And in other states, hopefully, they'll just help you out because they want to. Because want
Mhm.
to. They're an insurance company, but
Yeah.
because you asked. And yeah, you'll get to the psychiatrist and they will be there to give you medication if you want it. You don't have to take meds just because a psychiatrist prescribes them, right? But that's going to be what they're going to do because that's what they do. They're going to learn all about you. They're going to try to give you an official diagnosis. And then they're going to try to figure out what medication could help you find healing And it may be an antidepressant. It could be something else. Maybe they'll, you know, talk to you about, ooh, I think your diagnosis might be something slightly different. Maybe we're looking at bipolar. Maybe we're looking at ADHD. Maybe we're looking at autism, things like that. And if you feel comfortable with what they're suggesting, start the meds. And if you don't feel comfortable, express that to them. Maybe that'll help them find meds that might be better for you, or try another opinion. You are still in charge. Just because they're a doctor doesn't mean that you're not in charge of your body anymore. And I think that's another thing people get scared of, is that they don't trust psychiatrists, and therefore they don't want to go into that space for fear that they'll lose control.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah, that's such a great point. And I like how you kind of tease everything apart, like even the difference of what a psychiatrist is and a therapist, because I think that can definitely be confusing, and just also the process of it. Because again,
Yeah.
similar to finding a therapist, it can feel like an overwhelming and daunting process, but it's totally doable.
Totally.
And, you shared so many valuable things today. And I'm sure we could go on and on and on. But with the respect of time, are there any final things that you want to suggest or recommend for somebody who is at the point where they're really struggling with anxiety or panic and wanting to take the next step?
The most important thing I want to tell people always is that you deserve help, and you deserve to put yourself first when you're struggling. I think many of us were raised to not complain or to minimize our problems, because of course somebody else's problems are always going to be bigger than yours. But you can't pour from an empty cup. And if you are in a place where you're not functioning very well, or you're unwell a lot of the time, or unhappy a lot of the time, there are so many people out there like you, Tati, who went to school to help you. And they want to help you. And they don't think you're bad for having these problems. They think you're normal and beautiful and human, and are excited to work with you on these things. So give yourself that gift. It's the greatest gift you could possibly give yourself, because it lasts your whole life. More than buying yourself a new outfit, or taking yourself to a spa, or even taking yourself on a nice vacation, therapy and a diagnosis, if you have one, and learning to look at the world and talk to yourself in a loving way is the most important gift you could ever, ever, ever give yourself, and you deserve it. That is my message.
Very well said. I love how beautifully you put that. You said that. And
Thank you.
I think that's so true. And so you have this great book with even more details and guidance on how people can get support if they're struggling with anxiety and panic. So how can people purchase the book and connect with you if they want to find out more about you?
My book is available on Amazon, and it is also available as an audiobook, which I am a professional audiobook narrator. So that was like the
Awesome.
one part of the book publishing process that was like, I know what I'm doing here. So get the audiobook. It's great. That's available on Audible. So Amazon and Audible. And if you want to interact with me, I make content on Instagram at Get Thee to a Therapist. It's a really fun page where I do all sorts of reels that talk about everything to do with having an anxiety disorder, but also accessing services and standing up for your rights, especially in the workplace, which is something I'm very passionate about for people with mental health conditions. So yeah, find me there. It's a great page.
Perfect. Yeah. So I will share the links to all of that in the show notes. And it was great to have you on the podcast, Reba. Thanks so much for being
Oh,
here.
thank you so much for having me. It was really fun.